really one of the last straws. It was so abominable, so oppressive to the colonists that the Parliament would actually, in an effort to keep us from revolting, rescind the Stamp Act, but it was, of course, the last straw. When Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he wedded the new American soul to the idea, to the concept of natural rights, that our freedoms come from our humanity, which comes from God. Our freedoms don't come from any government. You would think that that idea would have been as popular then as it is in this room, but in 1787, when Jefferson was in Paris and James Madison was carrying the argument in Philadelphia in the hot summer of 1787, Hamilton and Adams and the big government boys actually argued with this principle. And they advanced an idea which lawyers and legal scholars today call positivism. And positivism accepts the ugly notion that the law is whatever the government says it is, and that without the government there can be no freedom, and therefore freedom must come from the government. And they tugged and pulled between Jefferson and Madison's natural law arguments and the ugly notion of positivism. Of course, the Constitution would never have come into existence without the Bill of Rights, upon which Jefferson and Madison insisted as a condition for the ratification of the Constitution. And thus there came into existence the greatest governmental force for good in the history of the world, which was the creation of the American Republic. And when you think about how it came into existence, it's the opposite of what happened in Europe. In Europe, kings and potentates gave in to the demands for liberty from their subjects. That was power granting liberty. But when we created the American Republic with the idea that the individual is greater than the government, that the individual, which has an immortal soul, can live forever, the government is just an artificial creation based on force, we accepted the notion that this was liberty granting power. Right. So this government only exists because we consent to it. Unfortunately, after 8 years of the experiment, they would start the trend toward totalitarianism, which brings us to the fascism and socialism and loss of liberty, which we suffer from today. The government would enact in the John Adams administration the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were enacted because, you know what? There are French agents out there, and they're foreigners. And we have to be afraid of them. And we have to make it illegal for them to speak freely. And you know what? If they sow sedition amongst us, it could topple the government. So we have to make it a crime. The same generation that signed the Declaration and wrote the Constitution and enacted the Bill of Rights made it a crime to criticize the President, members of the Cabinet, members of the Supreme Court, and members of Congress. And persons were actually prosecuted and incarcerated for ridiculing those individuals. By the way, who's missing in that list? The Vice President. Who was the Vice President? Thomas Jefferson. He didn't want the protections of the Alien and Sedition Acts because he understood the value He understood the value of a free market in ideas. And of course, when he became president, he refused to enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts and let them expire of their own dead. I get a lot of heat for saying it.
You know your history.
I will say it again. The worst president in American history who slaughtered 700,000 Americans. And who followed this Alien and Sedition Act nonsense that in wartime, liberty has to be suppressed. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Lincoln locked people up for speaking out against his administration of the war, including a notorious case involving an unfortunate congressman named Clement Vallandigham from Ohio, about which Tom Woods and other historians could speak for hours. It's a horrific case. After Lincoln's death, a Supreme Court essentially appointed by him would rule unanimously that the president doesn't have the power to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and doesn't have the power to try civilians before military tribunals as long as the federal courts are able to sit, as long as the riots in the streets are not so severe that the judges can't get to their courtrooms. In World War I, Woodrow Wilson, who was president of my alma mater in his earlier years, presided over the Espionage Acts, which are still good law, and which make it a crime to say things to encourage people not to do their civic duty, whatever that means. A guy named Abe Gitlow threw leaflets in Yiddish out of a tenement in Lower Manhattan, and those leaflets encouraged people not to go to work. And because some of the people who didn't go to work worked in the arms industry, he was prosecuted for violating that act, and he served time in jail because of what he wrote in Yiddish on pieces of paper that ended up in a gutter in New York City. Their fear at the time was anarchists. Today they call anarchists enemy combatants. History just repeats itself over and over and over again. And of course, FDR locked up 10,000 Italian Americans in New Jersey and Nevada. You might not have known that. Along with 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast because of their ancestry. No crime, no charge, no judge, no jury, just locked up, separated from family, loss of property, loss of business, loss of dignity, loss of liberty, and the Supreme Court, in one of the worst decisions in modern American history, about which my friend Tom Woods, who will speak shortly, has written a masterpiece explaining this excess, condoned this awful decision by FDR, which he didn't even have the courage to sign himself, but had a general sign it. Now we come to 1977 in the Carter administration, and the act of monstrosity called FISA. And FISA basically takes the Fourth Amendment and says we're going to cut a hole in it. Jefferson and Madison insisted on the Bill of Rights. They insisted on the quintessentially American amendment, the Fourth Amendment, which guarantees, next to the right to live, the greatest of all rights, as Justice Brandeis called it, the right to be left alone. And to assure that the government would leave us alone, but to give the government legitimate powers to go after people who were engaged in criminal activity. The Fourth Amendment required that when the government wants to enter your property, it must go to a judge, a truly neutral judge with something lawyers call probable cause, evidence sworn to under oath, demonstrating to this neutral judge that it is more likely than not that the property sought or the person sought has committed a crime or contains evidence of a crime. That system, with the exception of wartime, worked pretty much for 200 years until FISA came along, and the Carter administration, in a perverted effort to correct what Richard Nixon got away with during Watergate, which is the attitude that if the president says it, it must be lawful. If the president does it, therefore it's lawful.